Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Makerusa Porotesano. We're going to get started really quickly here. And I just want to thank you. Give thanks to everyone who's showing up live for the presentation, and for those who are watching the recording. We're excited to have you all here, and I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Do some housekeeping. And just know that we're joined by supporters, staff, students, and guests of PCC's community. The presentation is set for just over an hour, so please do whatever it is you need to stay attentive, right? So if that's eating during the presentation, this is not your Zoom class. You're here on your own time, so you do you. And we're streaming live on many platforms, and this workshop will be saved for folks to come back to. So if there was something and you're like, oh, I need to get back on that and see what they said, or looking for resources or links, by all means, you'll be able to come back to the presentation and check it out on our various platforms, which I believe is the Men of Color Leadership Program, Facebook page, the Sylvania Multicultural Center, I believe, the Cascade Multicultural Center, and also the Sylvania Multicultural Center YouTube page. So check those all out, and we'll see what's good with everybody there. And we plan to be interactive in the chat, so please feel free to join us. Write whatever however you want to reply back in the chat, and we'll be able to pull that up on screen. So we'll be good there. We want to do a quick land acknowledgement for those who are in my class or my program. This is a practice I do, and I do it just a little bit different. Land acknowledgements are really important. They take place in my own cultural upbringing and protocol, that we acknowledge the land that we're on and that we're visiting or that we're occupying at this time. PCC does have a land acknowledgement themselves. I'll read that real quickly, and then also just dig in it just a little bit deeper, because it's not enough to just read a land acknowledgement, but also to commit to something deeper. So we like to start this event by acknowledging the room that I rest in right now. I mean, we're all broadcasting from different places, and I'm here in North Portland, the traditional village site of the Multnomah folks. People are also tuning in from the Catlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Moala, and many other tribes that made their home around the Columbia River and also the Willamette River. So Multnomah, and where I stay up in North Portland, is a band of the Chinooks that lived in this area. I think more specifically Soviet Island and those places around Kelly Point Park. The other thing too is, to dig a little deeper. Where are all those names we're talking about? What's a resource we can dig into? So here is a book, and I think what I need to do, tech person, if you could get rid of the slide so we can show this. There you go. Not the greatest sources, but it is a source. I'm a guide to Indian tribes of the Pacific Northwest. This is the latest edition. My recommendation is check it out as a starting point. And this is a book that belongs to our Multicultural Center at the Sylvania campus. So anytime folks want to check this out, when we get back on campus, otherwise you can check this book out or buy it and support it. Other resources, if you're looking to dig into more decolonizing themes, I would always say check out Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Some basic reading for a lot of those who are just dipping into what it looks like to conceptualize decolonization. This is not specifically around Native American communities, but it is something that a lot of our indigenous studies and ethnic studies folks will dip into. And then for me as a Samoan, this is a great resource that I like to recommend to students. It's called Susu Manongi. It is from Leafionga Tuiatuatupu Tamasese Taisiefi. He's the former head of state of the independent state of Samoa. So those are some resources and ways so folks can just kick in just a little bit deeper and just do a little bit more outside of our land acknowledgements. Workshop objectives and some rules. I don't know how much of these are rules, but the objectives for sure is we're trying to engage folks to rethink, relearn, and re-engage with the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. We aim to create creative understanding of the movements he led, the mistakes he made, and the victories he sought to improve our own work and our collective movements. The one thing we specifically left out of the title and really we're very intentional around there was the doctor and the reverend part. And I think when we talk about critical, this is the crazy part about it, is that this stuff really is really basic information about Dr. King. And we're taught to celebrate King in schools. We get a day off. There's big marches that take place, and folks haven't even read his books. People have never really had a chance to dive into his theology. He's an organizer too. How does he organize? Right? So to be critical in this sense to us is unfortunate that we're using these terms because it's really basic information, but we have to reintroduce that to our community and to our folks. And when that happens, this is where we have to start from the very beginning. So this is the look into some ways that his legacy has impacted our lives, both good and bad, and to explore what it looks like to celebrate historical figures, our heroes, and that we can be critical of them and still celebrate them at the same time. We're not here to demolish King's legacy. We're here to be critical about it, because there's going to be more folks that we look into in the future who deserve the credits they do, and we can learn from their mistakes. If it's just all good stuff and then we just put them on the pedestal, then we can't make the adjustments to carry on his legacy and be better, as I'm sure he all wanted for all of us. Here's some agreements, workshop objectives, or community agreements. This is on YouTube, so it's kind of hard to do this. It's not like you can interrupt me while I'm speaking. Sort of why we went on here. And, in terms of a one mic, having one person speak, one of the other ways we can do this is on the chat box or the comments threads. Sometimes those things can get dominated by anybody. And so we're asking us to just share that space too. We have one comment box, and we would like everyone to use it as much as possible. We're also asking folks to be open to the outcome and not set on it. This is a 2-hour presentation on a man's legacy that we've been celebrating since his passing. There's no way we're going to be able to capture everything we need to in 2 hours. This is an introduction of some information we know isn't being shared. So if you're here to look for a very specific something to be said, it might not be said. And what we're asking is to be open to what we're bringing. And we'll do the same thing if there's information shared in the chat to help improve our workshop for next time. Create space for yourself, make space for others. Again, going back to the chat box, I think that coincides with the next bullet point, which is to be brave, not perfect, right? So as you're making space for yourself, share what your thoughts are. Maybe we can help you out. And we'll never be able to explore where your mind is at if we're not putting ourselves out there to ask those questions. And people aren't perfect, and so we're not going to hold folks to perfect. This is sort of the theme of this workshop too on Dr. King, that you can take a chance in this space, and we're going to just try to do this collectively. So we're going to think the best intentions of everybody. And if this gets too heavy, take care of yourself. If you have something else you need to do, go take care of yourself. We want you to, enjoy this workshop as much as we enjoy presenting it to all of y'all. So, like I said earlier, do you make this work for you? And I think we'll make things work a lot better. So we're gonna go ahead and introduce ourselves. We're gonna pull Briana. Boom! What's up, Briana?
Hey everyone! So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is so weird to introduce ourselves. Maybe I'll introduce you a little bit, and then we'll go from there. And I just started talking at people. I didn't really say who I was either.
If you want to start with you, feel free.
Oh my goodness. Well, I will say this. Briana, who's now at Oregon Food Bank, used to be our our colleague and still our friend at PCC was the Sylvania Multicultural Center coordinator, and has since transitioned over to Oregon Food Bank. And it's just can I just say it's really great to still stay in community and bring you back here to PCC. And I know there's some people who are just here to see you.
Thank you, Mac. That's really kind. I'm really glad to be back and to still be in community. PCC has like a huge piece of my heart. So
awesome. And I'm Mac. Folks can call me Mac. Makerusa, Porotesano, he, him, his pronouns. I'm still at PCC. So Sylvania Multicultural Center coordinator and Men of Color Leadership Program supporter. Shout out to Dr. Meeks and all the students who may be watching right now. Cool. All right. Anything else you want to say, Briana, before?
Yeah, I can give a little bit of context about why this work matters for me here, if that would work. Okay. So Briana Stansbury, she, they pronouns, and I'm now at Oregon Food Bank, like Max said. And one of the reasons why this work and Dr. King's work really resonates with me on a personal level is that my parents were married in 1987, and that was 20 years after Loving v. Virginia passed in the Supreme Court. So it was a Supreme Court decision that allowed interracial marriage to be legalized in the United States. And my dad is Black and my mom is white. And so I call it 20 short years because they still faced massive discrimination in 1987 trying to get married. They found churches that wouldn't marry them. They had people boycott their wedding. They had folks outside protesting. They persisted. They chose love, and love meant more to them than the adversity they would face pursuing it. And so watching them cultivate love as an antidote to white supremacy is sort of like the ethos that I carry with me in the work. And it inspired me to look at systems change and policy change and praxis change and to move through that with love. So that's part of what invigorates me around Dr. King's work, is that ethos of love.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And while we've done this presentation a couple times, just folks give us some slack as we go through our slides together. We've had to make some adjustments, and so I might be jumping in places where I'm not supposed to.
Oh, no, you're all good, Mac.
I hope so. I believe this is your part.
Yeah, so we conceptualize this workshop sort of as a way to disrupt the common narratives of activists. And we hold our activists to really high esteem. And so the goal here is to critically engage with the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to employ sort of this both and philosophy when we think about his activism. And both and today we're defining as we might grapple with holding simultaneously and equally truthful narratives. And so in this workshop, our aim is to really interrogate, how do we utilize this both and philosophy and hold activism accountable? And so to that end, our goals are to connect King's work to our organizing and understanding in our movements, to reimagine the scope of Dr. King's work, to learn how to be critical and curious about historical figures, and to seek to understand Dr. King's philosophies. And we hope to move beyond the "I have a dream" speech and to take a closer look at everything before and everything after. We'll likely talk history, we'll talk political and deeply personal, and we'll talk about this particular moment in time and how Dr. King's work relates to it. So thank you. I'm hoping that this time together will be informative and engaging and thoughtful.
All right, so those who are streaming online, we're just going to ask a question for everyone to share in the chat. And we give you like 2 or 3 minutes, maybe with some music, to ask you, who is Dr. King to you? Dr. King holds many identities. He's influenced folks in many different ways. Who is Dr. King to you? We'll give you about like 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll pull up some of those answers in the chat or blast them on our screen over here. Look forward to hearing your answers. Awesome. Very cool. Oh, Sir Calvin, good to see you. Shout out. All right. Thank you all for participating. These are great ways for us to see who Dr. King is to a lot of folks. So, um, one of the identities I like to write, I wrote in there, I think he's a really underrated writer. He's a beautiful writer, and I really enjoy reading his pieces. And for everyone else who put in, the many things, the many identities they see them as, thank you so much for participating. All right, so is this me or you, Briana? This is me, right? All right. We're one of the identities we're going to look at, or a piece of Dr. King's work. We talk about it a lot, and is Dr. King as his nonviolent movement. It's brought up a lot, especially in the last 2 years as folks took to the streets. I felt a lot of the time his name was thrown around and probably used in the wrong context a whole lot around what is his nonviolent movement. Maybe folks, how many of you have ever heard of his principles for nonviolent movement? And if you had, maybe add one of the principles into the chat, and let's just see where folks are at in terms of how they understand Dr. King's nonviolent movement or his principles. And while that's happening, I'll start kicking into what these are. And also, if you've never heard of the principles of nonviolence, welcome to the club. You're not the only one. Usually when we bring this up, it's like, oh, I didn't understand that there were these principles. There's an actual article in an academic journal of Dr. King's writing where he's able to put this down. And we're actually going to revisit what the principles mean in terms of his ability to use this in direct action. So for those who've taken the Social Justice 210, you might know some of the different ways of organizing. We got direct action, we got education, we have direct service, we have advocacy. And in terms of direct action, these are the principles Dr. King would use to uphold his beliefs around nonviolence. So nonviolent resistance means, and is also neither cowardice or passive, right? So nonviolent resistors are not cowards, but they're strong individuals. So it takes strength to resist the use of violence. I think the rhetoric at the time is, well, if we're not fighting back, then, we're not showing our strength in numbers to the best of our ability. Dr. King's work was to say, actually, it takes more strength and it takes more organizing skills to do this peacefully. And we're going to win the moral battle around the movement we're trying to do, and for those who are looking to oppress us. The other thing I like is, and the next two is, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding of the opponent, not to humiliate. This is like light years away from, I think, where we're at today. And it's kind of frustrating when folks are using Dr. King's, his reframing his methods for nonviolence and then trying to humiliate others with that same rhetoric. It happens a lot in mainstream media, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, that a lot of people who know very little about Dr. King end up throwing his rhetoric in a way and using it in a way, that doesn't. Yes, Amanda, that's a great one. And actually, I think we're gonna show that as well. Evil itself, not the people committing evil acts, should be opposed. And so, for those who take a lot of our part of our student leadership training, if you're in the Career Resource Center, the Men of Color Leadership Programs, the Multicultural Centers, and the Women's Resource Centers, even with our Dreamers Resource Centers, and other leadership opportunities in the VRC or ASPCC, should understand that, like, we're not here to attack people directly. If in using Dr. King's principles, is more about, hey, some people act the way they do because of the systems that are involved. And so we talk a lot about attacking like the systemic problem. We're also talking about understanding that those systemic issues produce certain thoughts for people to exude. So what we're saying is we're going to focus on the bigger issue, which is the evil itself and the acts, and not so much the folks. And this is the other thing too. We want, our students to understand, or those who are watching on the screen right now, is that these are Dr. King's principles of nonviolence. This is also something that came out 60, almost 70 years ago. Am I doing 40, 50, 60 years ago? Not a math major. And they might not work today. They might not be the principles that you uphold yourself today. And so I think we should think really critically about ourselves when we're wanting to do and be about this life. And maybe it's not for us. I think there's also ways to be critical. Like me personally, I'm not looking to, I don't think you have to seek friendship and understanding only. I'm not in the business of humiliating folks, but I also don't feel like I have to be someone's friend afterwards. Right. And so these are different principles and values that we might have for ourselves, but it's also just knowing what Dr. King meant and felt and was trying to project into the movements and organizing that he was doing. Oops, I am using the wrong. I'm like turning a slide on one thing, but it's not doing it on the right one. Okay, here we go. Those committed to nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation, as suffering itself can be redemptive. So this is another thing, and I think this is also tied into the theology of Dr. King, and a lot of that is, and why he felt like it takes a lot of strength, is because of the ask for folks to not retaliate. I think this is one of the more popular ideologies around principles of nonviolence that's projected a lot, and might be one that sounds familiar to a lot of you folks out there. Nonviolent resistance avoids external physical violence as well as the internal violence of the spirit. So nonviolent registers not only refuse to shoot his opponent, but also refuses to hate him. This is one I didn't understand or realize at first, and I was like, oh man, this is a lot deeper than the initial thought of like, just don't fight back physically. I think that's the thing that's always highlighted most, is that they're breaking windows or they're burning down houses. That's usually the actions that we focus on in terms of the external physical violence. And going back to looking at the humiliate, it's also, we're not going to be violent in our words. We're not going to be violent in our practices. And I think there's a lot that can be there. In my organizing experience, I feel like this is something that resonates a lot in our organizations, that we want to hold, safe and critical spaces in a way that allows people to not feel attacked in a lot of our centers or organization spaces, in the classroom. And this is one of the principles of nonviolent movements. is to make sure that we're also not attacking people spiritually with our words. And then the last one is nonviolent registers must have a deep faith in the future, stemming from the conviction that the universe is on the side of justice. And I think this is also one that also, this is another principle that's rooted in his theology, that because we're doing the right thing for the right reasons, we will prevail. And a lot of this is also rooted in his theology around building and holding the morale, despite a lot of the suffering that a lot of folks who lived in the movement and put their lives on the line for the movement, um, to really for them to hold on to the fact that this is going to prevail in the end. And I don't know anything about like marching. You hear stories. We watch a lot of documentaries in our research around this, and that's a lot. I mean, those folks who participated in the marches and just held on to the principles of nonviolence and just holding deep faith. That's I can only imagine the the kind of power that they hold inside to maintain that. That resonates on a much deeper level than I think I've ever had to face in my personal life. Briana, do you have anything else you want to mention around these principles of nonviolence before we kick into the next part? And you're muted. Sorry.
That's so funny. I've been over here just like agreeing with you and like really feeling what you're putting down. No, I don't have anything to add. Just appreciative of the sentiment around the fortitude that it must have taken, right, for folks to be in the streets in this way and to fight in this way for liberation. So yeah, thanks for pointing that piece out too.
And then just opening up back up to folks in the chat again. So, what are the principles of your own movements or your own creed in life? Can you identify movements you're working in and what principles guide your work? Feel free to put the answers in the chat, and then we'll share your answers live on the screen. We'll give folks about a minute or two while that's happening. Briana, do you want to share? Do you have any principles around some of the work you're doing currently, especially in your organizing work?
Absolutely, yeah. Some of the organizing work is really centered on transformative justice. So moving as far away from a carceral state as possible, looking at how we mitigate and amend harm through relationship building and through care rather than consequences or policing. So that's one of the frameworks that we're using at Oregon Food Bank and that I use in my personal life.
Ah, nice. I think for myself, especially along with my other Pacific Islander scholars and activists, it's always around the principles around ocean and sacred space. The ability to be inclusive. The ocean is something that holds us together, not separates us. So that space between us is in the journey to close those spaces closer together, or actually the opportunities we have to create community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll also I'll mention this part. This is not an easy question to answer. This is like some final level MLK class though. We're like, all right, what are the principles of your movements? Now that you learned, we just went over this 5 minutes ago, y'all. This is not something you should know right off the top of your head. And it's something to think about. So as you look into Dr. King's principles for nonviolent movement and maybe think to yourself, oh, I didn't even think about how deep this work goes. Maybe think about what that means for your own life and the work you do and what principles you live by. And are you upholding those? It's one thing to have the principles. Dr. King had those principles. He asked all his followers to have those principles. But doesn't mean everyone follows all of them. I got some principles too in my life. I don't follow them very well. I can lay off the Taco Bell a little bit more here and there. But on a more serious note, these are hard to obtain. They're good guiding principles for life and for that movement. And we have them too in the work we do. and it's a lot of work. So don't worry about not being able to answer that question. I struggle with that myself, and it's taken a while to come to where I'm at, especially around ocean. All right, Reverend King. So this is the other part. This is where we start getting a little critical. He's also a reverend. How many of you have ever read any of his sermons? Oh, I got something else I gotta say. I totally forgot about this. This is also rooted in Dr. King's work about sustaining a movement. The first 40 students who sign up for the link we just put in the chat boxes will receive a $25 card to help pay for what would have been a beautiful lunch in person. So that meal that we weren't able to sustain because we're working remotely can be provided to you. Please fill out the link that's in the chat. Thank you so much, moderator, for reminding me to do. I was supposed to do that like at the beginning, but here we are, and the show goes on. Understanding King's theory or theology. My favorite book, been my favorite book for a long time, is Strength to Love, which is a collection of Dr. King's sermons. Not all his sermons, just a few that were chosen and published. I would highly recommend folks go out and read that. And understanding his sermons, I think it's also good to look at how he used that sermon, not only for the movement, but for understanding how we exist in terms of justice, right? And like what that means. A knock at midnight is a play off the parable, which is used in the setting of midnight. And the backdrop is in the hour of need, someone is knocking on the door. I think in this case, in the Bible, they're looking for food. And the person who owns the house is in a conundrum because they're not sure at midnight if they should be opening their door to this person in need or whatever's on the other side. One of my favorite quotes from this sermon is Dr. King would say, "Fear knocked on the door, faith answered, no one was there." And the whole premise of the sermon is, in his time, and we could think about this in our time too, that we might be in the midnight order of society. Dr. King is asking folks in this order of society of midnight that when the time comes for someone to knock on your door, will you answer? And will you have the resources provided? And in this case, bread to give to those who need it or resources. And this is written at his time. And so he's telling everybody, hey, we have this thing going on right now, this racial inequity. And we're asking for help. Who's going to answer the door? And there's many variations of this. But one of the things we found when we were doing this workshop, and Briana, feel free to kick in because I remember we experienced this together. It's not only just that people have to answer the door in this order of midnight. It's also that it's not as easy for some people to open the door. I remember when we did this workshop, there were a group of young women who were like, it's midnight and you're asking me to open the door. And I was like, no, I'm not asking anyone. I'm just, the question is posed out there. And thank you so much for bringing that up, because this is not something that's mentioned in his sermon or having to have a thought about. It's, 50 years later that we're asking ourselves this question, that there's intersections that come into play around what it means to answer this door. What I do like to add on to it, though, is when those who have a harder time to open the door, that I hope the kind of celebration and love and admiration is offered to those folks who make those kind of sacrifices to make that happen. And this is really the theme of his knock at midnight, in a newer version. What will you do to answer that and to be prepared? It's one thing to answer the door. It's another thing to answer the door with bread in your hand. And this is the main theme of this sermon around the knock at midnight. And it's very creative. So this is the other thing about Dr. King's theology that I think is very beautiful, and why I say he's a very underrated pastor or writer, because his sermons are electric. Like this is why it's my favorite book. Like I can almost hear him speaking to me when I read the book. It reads so much in the way that he's projected in terms of his live speeches and whatnot. So this is just like one of the themes of his theology that we're exploring when we talk about the knock at midnight. So we're going to ask some of these questions to folks out there, and feel free to answer any one of these. And when you answer it in the chat, just say that you're answering Q1, Q2, Q3, and then give your answer. But the first question we're asking folks is, what are your feelings around answering the door at midnight? Your feelings around answering the late night knock at the door. Question 2 is, what is the midnight atmosphere today in your world? At that time, it was around racial justice and equity. It was about the right to vote, jobs, and money. What is the midnight atmosphere today for you? And then question 3, what bread do you have for your neighbor? We'll give y'all, let's just put another 2-3 minutes up there while we kind of answer this ourselves. Briana, what does this make you feel, this knock at midnight? What is the midnight order in your life right now?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I feel like the midnight order is always Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, right? Like how we continue to strive and reach for collective liberation in our communities. I think that is the knock, that is the call. And figuring out what that bread is to offer for the movement is a lifelong commitment. Sometimes that bread looks different, right? At different times. What about you, Mac? What do you think?
Yeah, there's so many knocks, right? There's so many atmospheres we live in. One of the things I'm doing right now is working with a houseless veteran group called Do Good, and trying to help them get squared away with some of the internal workings that they're doing, so they can provide better services to houseless veterans. And that's a huge chunk of work. Like I think about that a lot, and I'm just like, oh, there's so much there. And sometimes I feel like we're taking on too much where we don't have enough bread to pass out to everybody. And it makes me go back to my own identity. I identify as a Christian. I go to church on Sundays, especially when my mom makes me. And there's all these parables about breaking bread and sharing our resources with everyone to make sure they have enough to eat. But yeah, shout out to Do Good and See Change folks if they're listening. Really appreciate their work. All right. Not singing a lot of stuff. Thanks, Allison. Yeah, very true. Mental health awareness. Yes, thanks for Calvin. And, as folks listen to the recording, you'll still be able to put something in the chat and we'll be able to go back and check that out. But thank you all for participating. If you're still on this, the program, feel free to just put your answers in later if you need more time.
Sweet. I will talk a little bit about love in action. Thanks, Mac, for getting us started and setting such a good foundation. I know I can't see you all right now, but I'm hoping you'll humor me a little with an exercise. So I'm hoping that folks can sit back or stand back from your monitor, relax your body, maybe maneuver into a comfortable position, and take a really deep breath. And if you're able and you feel comfortable, please close your eyes for a moment. I want you to envision a moment or a time when you felt truly safe and truly held in community. Who was with you in that moment? Where were you? What were your surroundings? What did safety, community care smell like? What did it sound like? What did it feel like? What did safety and community care look like? I want you to envision that and hold that in your body. As I welcome you back to this space, opening your eyes and returning to your monitor, if you feel comfortable, please drop in the chat what came up for you when you thought about being in community and being in safety. What did being in safety feel like for you? And what were some of your answers to those questions? And maybe, Mac, we'll start with your answer if you're prepared, or if you feel okay sharing.
I just was taken back to my village in American Samoa and some of those village gatherings that take place. I'm just seeing family and food and abundance and a lot of sharing of those resources. Kids running around, and it's just, and it's warm. It's warm back home. My safe place is warm.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, when I think of that safety and that community care, I also think of family and friends and loved ones. Often when I do this exercise, I think of warmth too, both like metaphorical warmth of being with good friends, and but also the literal warmth of heating, like being hot and having access, right, to that. Oh, I'm seeing in the chat, yeah, like laughter and gratitude. Yeah, I think of abundance in food and sharing that with my friends and my family. I come from a culture where breaking bread together is part of safety. It's part of community care. It's part of wellness. And I think of being surrounded by my loved ones and feeling that love from them and getting to express that love to them. On April 15th, 1960, in Raleigh, North Carolina, Dr. Martin Luther King stood before over 200 student and adult activists gathered at Shaw University for an Easter weekend youth conference to discuss the growing sit-in movement. And he said, there is another element that we must be present in our struggle that then makes our resistance and nonviolence truly meaningful. And that element is reconciliation. Our ultimate end must be the creation of the beloved community. What you just envisioned when you thought about safety, when you thought about community care, you envisioned and breathed into life the feeling of the beloved community. As we continue to talk about beloved community, I want you to tap into that body feeling, into that goodness, and into that care again. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work at Oregon Food Bank, if that's okay. And I promise to tie it to my work at PCC when I was here. So I want to hone in on this term beloved community. Beloved, it's an adjective. And at Oregon Food Bank, it's a common descriptor we use to hold dear and close the care we feel for one another and for our work and for our communities. And I think that's comparable to the ways that we hold care for the work we do, the equity work we do in the resource centers at PCC. But beloved is also, it's a verb, it's an action. It's a way we employ and move through and press against and uphold and break down, right? It's actionable. And so to be in a beloved community and enact love is action-oriented at its core. I'm going to quote a renowned feminist theorist and a personal hero of mine, Bell Hooks, and also rest in power to Bell Hooks, who passed earlier this year. She says, the word love is most often defined as a noun, yet all the most astute theorists of love acknowledge that we would all love better if we used it as a verb. King knew that the way towards the beloved community was the downfall of what he called the three big evils. And these evils were racism, poverty, and militarism. And in his particular moment in time, King focused militarism specifically on the Vietnam War. But I like to broaden that, and I align with the Poor People's Campaign in seeing militarism as a broader definition that's including but not limited to state-sanctioned police violence, imperialism, colonialism, the prison industrial complex. And I bring up these three components because I think it's really easy for people to water King down, which Mac has definitely talked about. And I think it's really easy for folks to water King down on Dr. Martin Luther King Day. And I think we'll watch Democratic leaders subtweet non-contextualized Dr. King quotes throughout the year, right? Totally missing this action piece, missing this beloved piece. And we'll watch leaders use Dr. King's words pretty disrespectfully to sell products and market campaigns and promote toxic positivity. And we'll watch folks pull terms like nonviolence and I have a dream and spin them against movements that I believe Dr. King would have been really proud of. And in particular, I want to highlight the Black Lives Matter movement and the incredible solidarity both nationally and in Portland streets last year in the continued fight for Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. So as fascist governments and systems they uphold continue to deny that Black and Indigenous lives matter, we as communities have continued to demonstrate our collective resilience, our collective power, our collective joy, and our dedication to this beloved community. And so today and every day, I beg that we're discerning about the lies we're told about Dr. King and his body of work. And I want us to remember that he said, and I'll quote, large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And I think that's so applicable for our current cultural moment. We are still resisting the same government and the same structures that assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967. We are still resisting the same white liberalism that showed 63% of Americans had a negative opinion of Dr. King in 1966, a year before he was murdered. We are still using direct action tactics that came out of the civil rights movement, often born from Dr. King, including, but not limited to, I quote, anchoring our external direct action with the power of economic withdrawal. Disruption and inconvenience have always been part of King's work, no matter how much neoliberalism will wrongfully echo passivity. King was never passive. We continue to fight today against these pillars of injustice that Dr. King decried, and we continue to fight against a racist and militarized system. I'll quote him one more time here. We must see how the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. At Oregon Food Bank, and I promise I'll make another leap back to PCC, one of our aims is to eliminate hunger and its root causes. And at PCC, when I worked in the Multicultural Center, our aim was deconstructing white supremacy culture. And we understand that root causes of systemic oppression is white supremacy. The white supremacy culture is a root cause of hungry communities, it's a root cause of disenfranchised communities, and we all must fight daily to dismantle these systems. I want to point out that in dreaming together today about collective care and about our beloved community, I'm so grateful for folks who dropped their answers in the chat and Mac for sharing. Nobody mentioned that police presence was a necessity to safety, or that military is a stakeholder in love, or that class hierarchy is a pillar of the beloved. In fact, it was quite the opposite. We talked about community, we talked about abundance, we talked about our needs being met, we talked about nature, and we talked about food, we talked about love. I sat on Jefferson High School's football field in the summer of 2020 with hundreds of other people preparing for one of the earlier marches to the Injustice Center downtown in protest of the systemic mistreatment of Black folks in this country. And an incredible organizer led us through a piece of this exercise, dreaming about our safety, and asked us to be curious about why our dreams of safety were void of police presence. The invocation, of course, was to think about abolition as a framework and as a reality. Today, I offer this exercise as an entryway into thinking about the work we still have to do to reach the beloved community, and to hopefully inspire you to think about love in action in your own lives. And I'll just pivot to the next slide here. Sweet. Thank you all for going through that exercise with me. I appreciate it. I want to name that I'll give folks a couple seconds to read this quote. It's a pretty famous one, so you might have heard it before. I love this quote for so many reasons, but one of them is the linguistic things I return to in this quote is the dichotomy between love and hate that's marked by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s choice of a verb. So he uses to drive, and I'll read it. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So returning to this choice of verb, to drive, to propel forward, to engage in movement, in action, right? That is an action verb. And so I'm returning to us to this original exercise of contextualizing the beloved community for ourselves. And we asserted that that meant action. And so now I just want to know, what does love and action mean? What does that look like for us? Feel free to drop in chat. What does love and action look like for you? For Dr. King, it looked like loving your enemies in the wake of brutality. It meant radically loving and loving wholly. It meant that only love can conquer evil. But he also was really discerning about it not being complacency. This isn't Dr. King saying resiliency is the way. He's not saying how hard can you get pushed and how many times can you get back up. That's not his message. This is him rooting into his praxis of the beloved, of action. And so it's quite the opposite of complacency, which we're taught to remember him with. Dr. King saying that a riot is the language of the unheard. He's this radical, beautiful anti-capitalist who believed in direct action. His sermon in this case is rooted in understanding that love must be knowledgeable too, so that loving your enemy must be informed. Over and over again, the Bible reminds us of the danger of zeal without knowledge and sincerity without intelligence, he says. He reminds us that our praxis is learning, that educating ourselves and becoming educated is part of our direct action work. I'm grateful to be, outside of my work, a part of an abolitionist accountability group. We're a group of Black, Indigenous, and folks of color who are Portland-based and identify to some degree as activists, and have an understanding that movement work is so much about moving away from intention and moving towards impact. And so in this little community, we recognized that in the early days of protest, some of the biggest hurdles and frankly, the biggest dangers were well-intentioned and ill-informed action, well-intentioned and ill-informed process, well-intentioned and ill-informed praxis, and well-intentioned and ill-informed people. And because we all run the risk of being well-intentioned and ill-informed about something or some things, I know I do, in movement work, we cultivated this little group to do that radical, action-oriented, and beloved work of learning together. And I'm so grateful for that learning and that ability to do learning in community so that we can do better when we know better. So if you're interested, please feel free to drop in the chat. What are some, that's my tangible love in action, but please feel free to drop in the chat. What are some of your tangible love in action?
Oh, just gotta shout you out some more too, Briana. I love, especially around the narrative around the beloved, and also just reframing a lot of his work and how easy it is to reconnect his theology back to his nonviolent principles. It's so easy to place everything back when you frame it in a way that's accessible. That I'm just like, my mind is blown.
Thank you. Is there anything I missed in my portions that you want to like piggyback off of or add to?
Maybe just on the bullet points. I think everything you said is Like I don't know what I'm really gonna say after you just said all these amazing points, and maybe I'll just focus on the actual sermon. So, in terms of love and new laws, or the way of the land can be changed through love, Dr. King is mentioning this like prophetic love of Christ in a way that even amongst all the beating he's taking before the crucifixion, he's still asking for forgiveness at the cross. And so we kind of go back to like, what are you willing to endure, or what cross are you bearing in this movement? And sort of going back to some of the student questions around this ability to answer the door. I think this is one of the few sermons where I think he's able to acknowledge that everyone has something that they might have to suffer in order to answer that door. And why, to even your point that you're making, Briana, I don't think he mentions clearly the resources needed to open the door. So educating ourselves so that that process is one that allows us to make a sound decision if that's the right time for us to do it, or how to do it in the best way, best practices, or Dr. Meeks like to say, intentional practices to do this work. So I love this. And I will say, of all the sermons that he wrote, Love in Action is my favorite. I mean, I kind of just self-identified as a active church-going person, that there are 4 accounts of the crucifixion of Christ, and Luke is the only one that recollects this forgiveness part, and it's one of the reasons why that book is my favorite book in the Bible. A lot of emotions are being shown there, so something for folks to check out if they want to read one of his more powerful speeches. I think this is a good one. Love in Action. Absolutely, Dr. Meeks. And I think he was being critical too of something that a lot of I think pastors are doing now as well, is just like, where are those churches? Where are the churches, and how are you stepping up for the injustice that's taking place? And are you matching the same kind of energy and endurance that's needed to address the social orders of the day? This is like a prime time for churches, I think, in a lot of organizing during the civil rights movement. I think late 50s to mid 60s, and we just don't see a lot of that action anymore, or they're not being recognized for the work that they are doing. So, be something to think critically about in the future. Okay. I'm also recognizing time that we hit the hour mark, so we're gonna go through some of these things. We are originally slated 3 to 5, but we wanted to not take up the whole 2 hours if we didn't need to leave time for Q&A. And after this next section, we'll do like a quick music break as well. So one of the, I always say like my favorites, but this is not my favorite, but I think it's the most creative sermon that that Reverend King has in this, Paul's Letters to the Americans. Has anyone read this before? Put some emoji love into the chat box if you got it. I remember one of these MLK Day presentations that a keynote speaker honored Dr. King by writing a newer, like 2018 version of Paul's Letters to the American. I thought that was really great. And it made me go back to reread Dr. King's letter again, only to feel like we're still in the same place almost. And I don't want to get too much into the letter. I think the point I'm trying to make here around Paul's letter, and I said it before, that I think he's a extremely underrated writer, Dr. King is how creative his writing is. Paul's letter was one of the first of its kind, an imaginary sermon. Usually these sermons that are played out are deeply rooted in in Bible stories or parables, and then maybe even things about the day. But this is almost futuristic in ways. Dr. King is talking about Paul, who passed away, years before, 1,000+ years, and it comes back into modern day and has a critique. I think one of the trippier ways I saw this projected, although very controversial, was the Boondock episode of Dr. King coming back to give his critique of the modern times, which I think this was like 2007 or 8. And folks can check that out if they want to. But basically, the theme of the letter is, and of the sermon is, that Paul comes back to this time in the 60s, and he's like, this is interesting that the teachings of our church aren't matching the values of this world. So it's not just the message of the world. I think it's more specifically of the United States. So, even today, where we might be boastful about how great this country is, Paul is talking about, there's so much wealth, yet you take away the necessities from the masses to give luxury to the classes, meaning the inequity around the wealth distribution. And, even if we're just, I don't know if this is where it comes from, but, there's an old saying that like the most segregated time in America is Sunday during church. And, you're just talking about the hypocrisy around diversity on Sunday. But we'll see more diversity and disaggregation in nightclubs and sports than we will in the churches, which were still segregated at that time. And then I think this is one of the most beautiful things. I share this a lot, and especially for our old, when I was in the Men of Color leadership, I'm still there with y'all. But when I was, in the lead, one of the lessons I'd always like to bring to the men is, and Dr. King always says this, is the understanding the difference between a vocation and an occupation. And, the quote that Dr. King is writing here is, we're so busy making a living rather than making a life, in the irresponsibilities of capitalism. Briana kind of mentioned it before. He's very anti capitalist structure. He's not opposed to people getting their money. It's just the money at the cost of what? Especially at that time when I think the rhetoric around the U.S. being a Christian nation, that they wasn't matching the Christian values, and sort of sparked this work to write this very creative piece around him playing the role, or his understanding of Paul and what that could mean for its relationships for Christians in the American context. Also, just like, hey, we got all these technical advancements. Like, you could fly somebody to the moon, and we can create all this wealth, but you can't solve some of the injustices. So there's so much greatness happening, but yet we can't take care of like some of these basic needs around feeding our everyday people, around bringing love into our work, into our community. And then also just talked about, we always talk about the shifting of narratives, for whether you're on the left or the right, that like everything's moving so far one way or the other. And I think that has something to do with King sees that as like a maladjustment to normalities or to righteousness. And, he called it maladjusted to normalities of today's society versus being adjusted to conformity. That we need to speak up and be critical around the injustices, and less adjusted to complacency. And, you can read the message right there. I think you get the point of it. I just think it's really, I just want to really emphasize that Dr. King just wasn't going out there and spitting off the top of the head all the time. That this stuff was recorded and written, and he had a lot of flavor and charisma in his speeches, but he was also very creative in his writing. And I think it's a shame that we don't get to see the breadth of his work in terms of his writing as well. So I would recommend going out to read Paul's letters as one of those creative pieces that Dr. King put together. Boom! It was a good time. If you need to go grab a snack or something, or you want to, just chop it up with Briana and myself, feel free to do that. We'll be here. We'll give folks maybe like a minute or two. This is even greater for those who are watching the recording, because you could just be like, skip, I'm ready to go. I kind of wish my classes were like that in undergrad, where I could just sit through a lecture and skip to the parts I need.
Hey, Amanda, I miss you too. Really nice to see you in here. I'll connect via LinkedIn soon. Or Marco Polo, maybe.
All right. Hopefully folks got what they needed. A stretch, a break, a snack break. Time to chat with Briana. I think we'll go ahead and get started with the next slide. We'll continue on. Oh, it's all Briana.
But big shout out to Monica, who is like all the logistics behind the scenes, moving people, flashing comments. I mean, incredible. Thank you so much, Monica.
And also shout out to Southeast Women's Resource Center, who helped provide the $25 food vouchers for folks. So don't forget, students, if you're on, fill out the sheet that's in the comment box. I think we'll have there we go, that link, and we'll put it back in the chat for folks to sign up for that $25. Yes, Monica is a one-person media department. We switched roles. I had to do this last night, and Monica's doing it right now. So we're all getting trained in this.
I can do some of this like recentering. We just wanted to make sure that we reflected back, after our break on what our goals were for our time together. And just a reminder that we're holding a both and framework here together. So we're grappling with holding simultaneously and equally truthful narratives. We're holding areas of gray together. And so in this workshop, we're really aiming to interrogate how do we utilize that philosophy to hold activism accountable, to the aim that our goals are to reimagine King's work, to learn to be critical of powerful figures, and to seek to understand King's perspective. And we're really trying to move beyond the "I have a dream" speech, and to take a closer look at everything that King has done and the implications of his amazing work. Oh, I've got this one. It's a little bit harrowing. It's a little bit harrowing, but we're going to critique Dr. King here. Dr. Martin Luther King was a misogynist. We're just going to say it. He, let's see, Michael Eric Dyson released a book titled "I May Not Get There With You, The True Martin Luther King Jr." And it was conceptualized and written for today's hip hop youth. The biography delves deeply into allegations about King's chauvinism and his promiscuity, as well as into the sexism in the civil rights movement in general. In this way, the text kind of complicates commonly held one-dimensional ideas and perceptions of King, which we've talked about. And also, it critiques the civil rights movement as a whole. I'm hoping that this whole presentation is disrupting the siloed belief of Dr. King. He was human, he was nuanced, he was complicated, and he was definitely flawed. Misogyny in the civil rights movement did not exist exclusively to Dr. King, of course. He did believe that a woman's place was at the home, enacting and contributing to the domesticity of a household. And sexism that existed in the civil rights movement was not siloed. It was a factor of the environment it was in, of a larger societal issue, of course. And King frequently cheated on his wife and held strong beliefs about traditional gender roles. I'll quote King's response, and these are kind of egregious, so just a trigger warning about misogyny. King's response to a cheated on wife was to suggest that she study her rival to learn what her husband wanted in a woman. And his direct quote was, "Are you careful with your grooming? Do you nag?" he asked. In another instance, he informed an unmarried woman grappling with whether to have sex that, I'll quote him again, "Real men still respect purity and virginity," and instructed an abused wife in a different instance to determine whether there was anything within her personality to justify such treatment, right? So really gross victim blaming that came directly from him. He asked her, "Are you sure that you have a radiating personality, a pleasant disposition, and that feminine charm which every man admires?" And he asked this in a column called "Miss Lonely Hearts." To newlyweds having trouble with her mother-in-law, he remarked, and this is another quote, "There is an expression that no home is big enough to have two women at its head." So he was deeply engrossed in this victim-blaming culture and incredibly misogynistic. And we know that extends further, that sexual harassment within the movement was prevalent. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, members have spoken out many times about the ways that women were siloed or not taken seriously. They were given less resourcing, even as they stood shoulder to shoulder with men within this movement, right? They were really the backbones of this movement and were often spoken over or their ideas were stolen, right? No amount of context can offset the disturbing truth that King and other male leaders not only ignored sexism, but were deeply complicit in it. And it's important that we reconcile the ways that we should be critical of King's praxis and of his ethos.
Thanks, Briana. And that makes me think too a lot of our work, especially those who are in the Men of Color Leadership Program and checking in, and why we might not have gotten to that curriculum yet, but it's going to happen for sure next term. Of why we look into a lot of dismantling sexism, misogyny, toxic masculinity is also to continue to improve upon on a legacy of for folks before us, and that if we don't talk about it as it being a problem, then we're not gonna know that it's something we need to take care of. And bringing this to light then holds us accountable to say, hey, this was existent then. We know misogyny still exists, but when we get into our movements and our organizing, that this needs to be something we need to dismantle before we carry on our work. And then we can be really critical of ourselves to say, yeah, we are continuing the legacy by holding them accountable for what they did, shifting the narrative to be something else, and then holding ourselves to a higher standard. And that can't happen if we're not being critical of what's taking place. So we got to call out King. We got to call out all these other gentlemen who also have legacies of their own of misogyny in the civil rights movement, and create a better place and a trajectory for what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is King's relationship with Byron Rustin, and I titled it "Rustin versus Victory." And the thing about Byron Rustin is he's fairly unknown still. I think there's more limelight on what he meant to the movement and what he brought to the table for civil rights, but still fairly invisible. And so we have videos that will highlight his work a little bit more. What I will share is Brian Rustin really is the engineer for taking King's work and making it applicable to organizing, and in this case, direct action. And when given the choice of either to stick by Brian Rustin's side, to keep him on the team, King chose not to. Many accounts, and one of them too is also that Brian Rustin understood the movement at the time and also voluntarily stepped down from the work in order for the greater good. But looking back at it from the framework we got it now too, is like, oh wow, this was also something that was a part of our time, specifically the treatment of queer folks in the movement. So we'll watch a video, and I'm gonna ask y'all to just give me a quick second because I gotta do some maneuvering here. So this first video we're going to show is just some of the work that Brian Rustin did in the earlier days, and then we'll check out his work as out gay rights, civil rights activist, and yeah.
April 23rd, 1947, Bayard Rustin and George Hauser were the principal organizers of the first Civil Rights Freedom Ride through the South. They titled it The Journey of Reconciliation. Two organizations were the ride's principal sponsors. The first was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the second was the Fellowship for Reconciliation. 16 men, 8 black and 8 white, embarked on the journey of reconciliation, created to force the United States to uphold the 1946 Supreme Court ruling that declared segregated seating unconstitutional. Morgan versus Virginia was a landmark decision with a 6-1 ruling in favor of desegregation, declaring segregation on interstate buses illegal. However, when they rode through Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Judge Henry Whitfield had some of them arrested. Ignoring the Supreme Court ruling, he sentenced the blacks to 30 days and the whites to 6 months on the Carolina chain gang. This has been a Breath of My Ancestors Minute, brought to you by the Institute of Radical Reconciliation. We must never forget.
Okay, and then we're going to show another video. Give me a second. All right. Let me just get my slide up real quick. Yeah, if you have any reactions, feel free to post them in the chat. But that was what we're trying to share with folks in these last closing hours is that not only was Dr. King important, but there's also people around him that were important. I think also Briana was mentioning it as well, that there was a lot of folks in the movement that didn't get their chance to be highlighted because of sexual orientation, gender in this movement. One of the things you might see, and I think purposely a lot of people wanted to not be there because they weren't trying to take some of the limelight or the attention away from Black communities, but there were a lot of white protesters who joined the civil rights movement that aren't often, and people of other racial identities and ethnicities that aren't highlighted a whole lot, but that were in that movement. That I think as we start to dig further, that their day will come and we'll be able to talk about them as well. Okay. We had just a couple more slides that we're going to share, and we'll get to close to the end of our presentation. And we're really getting to the end of this, and I don't need to play this video for folks to. Where am I at? I'm not trying to do this. Okay, here we go. Trying to play this video. I think we all know what it is, and then it's the one that's always showing why we're talking about, we named this thing Beyond the Dream for a reason. And it's just that so often Dr. King gets limited and confined to his one speech of I Have a Dream. The crazy thing about the I Have a Dream speech is that it's also condensed to just like 2 or 3 minutes. And so these kids, although very adorable and the video is very touching, they're only saying a part of the speech. The speech itself is like 19 minutes long. Not only is the speech long, but it had been recorded and given before. Dr. King had given his I Have a Dream speech prior to his the march in Washington. And I think it's important that we dig further to greatly examine what that speech is about, because as Dr. Michael Eric Dyson will mention in his writings, and so many other scholars too, about that speech is nothing without the setup from before. The context of a dream and this utopian world society that we highlight so many times isn't so much the dream without the nightmare that Dr. King lays out before the speech. And that nightmare is around that social disorder that we were mentioning in his sermons. That nightmare is why he needs those principles of nonviolence to combat the violence that his community is facing. And the hypocrisy of a country that holds itself very high, yet has these very dark practices that are affecting folks. And in this case, it's the ability for people of color, and specifically his community, Black folks, to have everyday rights, a right to vote, a right to get a job, and a right to provide safety for his family. All that's in the speech. We don't hear any of that. And as we look to rethink what that speech could be, I think it's very much in line of why we're asking folks to look deeper into the very um, into the hearts of his identities that he carries. I mean, y'all mentioned it at the very beginning. He's all those things. He's a civil rights icon. He's a scholar. He's a pastor. He's an organizer. Um, I think he's like he's saying, he's a visionary. Folks saying he's an example of peaceful diligence. He's a believer, a revolutionary, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist Christian. He's all those things. And he's so much more than a 2-minute speech. And he's so much more than we give him when we only give that 2-minute speech, that we have to dig deeper into the greater complexities of his work. So as we go into sort of our final parts of the presentation, I'm going to bring Briana back. We share some resources. We talked about books. I remember when we had our dear brother, he'll be on the next slide here, Dr. Khalid El Hakim. He mentioned to our class one year, they're like, how many books does Dr. King have out? And people were like, I don't know. And I forgot them too, because I've only read 2 of them. Actually, 3. I've only read 3. Strength to Love, Where Do We Go From Here, and Why We Can't Wait. The other 2, I didn't even read them yet. And for someone who's celebrated so much, we don't even know how many books he's got out. These aren't even part of your high school experience, your curriculum. But yet, we're just trying to say we can't confine him to that 2-minute speech. He's got so many more things to offer here. And these are just some of the books and resources, we're asking you to check out specifically of King. There's a lot of writings about King. We mentioned Michael Eric Dyson's book a couple times, but maybe just start like where he's at. That might be a good place. His writings. And then find other ways and other resources that, kind of take a deeper look into his life. But these are the ones that we know have been published. And we're asking y'all to come and check those out. The other thing, it's ongoing work of things we've done. So we brought our friend Dr. Khaled Hakim on campuses. He's also done a presentation last year. We hope to bring him back this year. And he'll show his museum that even takes a deeper look into what King's legacy is. We only did a 2-hour presentation. It's not enough. But our work will continue. So Dr. King's legacy, and for as much as we preach and rave about him, is more than just a day, which is why we did this all the way in March. Not to confine ourselves to Black History Month or to MLK Day, but to get in the practice that he can be talked about at any time. And we'll continue to bring up his work and spend our resources to share that out. So if there are things we didn't cover today, there'll be other times for us to dig into those things later. And if folks have recommendations, especially students, of what they would like to see and more information they'd like to know about, let us know so that we can either put together something for you, give you an opportunity to share that out, or go find the people who know more about it. We are not the end-all experts on this topic. We just care deeply about our students and know that Dr. King's legacy, and Briana shared a very beautiful story of why that means to her personally, is so important. And for me, as I'm not Black, but as an Islander, this is part of the ways that I participate in anti-Blackness, that the history of Black folks can still be contributing to the improvement of my own life. And it doesn't have to be confined in that way, and that the legacy of Black communities and Black voices can be a part of my upbringing in ways to improve myself. So check out this work as it happens. We'll bring it to y'all live and direct. And then the last part of our thing is questions. Use the comment box to ask a question about our presentation. If y'all have anything, this is the time to do it. And, we got both Briana and myself on the screen right now. So feel free to ask away.
As we wait for folks to throw their questions in the chat, can I offer a few statistics? Awesome. So I follow this amazing creator, Erica Hart, on Instagram. Highly recommend going to check out their stuff. Their handle is at iHeartErica. And they also have a podcast that's amazing. And on their Instagram page, Erica reminds us that Black folks today still make 30% less than white folks across the country, and that 98% of land ownership is still in the hands of white people. And so Martin Luther King believed in the radical redistribution of resources and the ultimate demise of capitalism as we know it, which we love. And so I hope that these statistics show you that we still have so much more work to do to eradicate those three evils that we talked about and to redistribute wealth. And on MLK Day, Bernice King tweeted, "Let's channel our love-centered energy into defeating injustice, living and speaking truth, not just to power, and working for justice, about which my father said, justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against it." So just wanting to uplift again the ways that love and action are central to our movement forward.
And for those who are watching this on the recording, feel free to put your question in the comment box anyways, because this is something we'll go back to and just to double check if questions were asked. And Briana, thank you so much for sharing that information. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I think we can just give some final words and thoughts. I'll start so that you can finish, Briana. But I think on behalf of the Multicultural Centers, our district team, we just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come back to us. Come back. We miss you. And because our friendships have lasted, I think we're greater than our work. I think it made it easy for me to come see you at Oregon Food Bank, and I hope that meant it was easy for you to come back to us at PCC and continue to. I felt like your mission wasn't PCC; it was justice, and you brought so much of that to our work, and we miss you greatly. I think we talk about you a lot. I don't think we talk about you a lot, and it just means a lot that we can continue to share space. And if there's more work and more ways or excuses to bring you back, we're looking for them, because I think the legacy you left here at PCC was impacted a lot of students, and we would be remiss if we didn't let you know that. So just wanted to make sure you knew that before this thing ends.
Thank you so much, Mac. That means so much to me. You're gonna have me crying on this workshop right now. I'm so grateful for my time at PCC and for the incredible colleagues I've gotten to work with and also to be friends with, right? To build community with. So thank you. I'm honored to be back and to be in this space with you. With you all.
All right. So Cody's asking, Cody Crone, I hope I'm saying that right, wanted to ask about King's books, and don't worry about it. We mentioned a ton of books, so it's kind of hard to remember which ones. And if there's any of those books you can recommend. I got a couple in mind. So I think there's different ones that are out there, and I think a good resource that folks can pick up, it's fairly inexpensive for how big it is, but a lot of authors, speech givers, speakers, folks who wrote in academic journals, they have something called readers. And MLK has a reader. Basically, it'll be a collection of all those journal entries, writings, interviews too, that those folks have done. So I see it fairly often. I used to have a copy, and then it got all wet and soaked, so I went and bought another one. But you can pick up the MLK Reader. If you're looking for only the resources in terms of the books that we mentioned, I really like. I spelled strength wrong on here, but Strength to Love is, I think, a good examination of his writing. And Why We Can't Wait is more some of his journal entries and academic writings. One of the things we didn't mention, because he's also he's got a doctorate. We forget that sometimes, and so not everything around his education is around the theology practices. So I think reading the Why We Can't Wait, you might see some of those readings that look into his social commentary. I think his ability and his access to education actually helped him connect a lot of his theology to the organizing work that he was a part of. So those will be the two, I think, that you can check out: the Reader and Why We Can't Wait.
I was going to say Strength to Love. And this is a little bit beyond the question, but I think reading Strength to Love and then All About Love by Bell Hooks back to back is just like such a gorgeous pairing. If you're looking for another reading.
Yeah, and there's a lot of books on Dr. King, and also things that critique him. So I think, oh gosh, what's the Cody? I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but there's a book around. It has got a funny title, sort of like That Nonviolent Movement Gets You Killed, and it brings a lot of light to Dr. King, who, although preached nonviolence in his in the movement building, he had bodyguards that held guns on him. Right, so it's not, and he owned guns, and so I think part of that critique or the critical look into what nonviolent movements mean is he was also forced to protect himself, which meant carrying weapons and armor. I still remember when I went and gave Cornell West a hug. He was just hugging everybody. It's not like we're good friends, and he's like, "Mac, I miss you," and hugged me. But I remember when I went to hug him, I was like, "Oh damn." It was like running into a wall a little bit because my man was wearing a vest. And I was told that, a lot of those times, Dr. King and other outspoken speakers of the time would often have to wear that kind of protection because of the constant threats on their lives. So nonviolent movement doesn't just mean the reaction part. They were also trying to protect themselves in that book. I'm gonna have to look up the name and I'll put it back in, but kind of give some critique around the nonviolent movement. We're not saying also, I think is good to mention, we're not saying that the nonviolent movement is the only way you're going to accomplish what you want in your own organizing. We're only highlighting what Dr. King was saying, and I hope you got the message too that I don't think all those things still work, but it's about the examination of it, and I still resonate with some of those. I would just make small critiques because not too many things stand the test of time. Yeah. And as movements and situations start to change, alterations to our the ways we organize have to as well. So I think also part of this is not getting stuck in 1960 and finding ways to make this work for us in 2022. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not seeing any other questions. I felt like I rambled enough to give people time. I was really stalling for some questions. I think we're good to go. Asking for a friend. Okay. There's a lot of Samoan churches. If you drive down Lombard past the grocery outlet, you'll see two of them. Got two Samoan churches next to each other. We throw gang signs at each other. Like, what's up? What's up? Love and peace. And it would be a Samoan Assembly of God, and then the Congregational Christian Church of American Samoa. There's a lot of LDS wards that are Samoan language as well. Okay. I think we're good. Briana, you feel good?
I feel good. Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun to be part of. And yeah, thank you all for being here in beloved community. Stay well, stay dangerous.
Yeah, don't forget to like us on Facebook. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. I should have said all this stuff at the beginning. And check out our Discord. And check us out if that's a cool way for us to interact with students. So much love to everybody. Thank you again, Briana. Thank you, Monica, for holding it down. Thanks, Jess, for all the support with the food cards. And thank you, everyone, for showing up today. Peace and love. We'll see you around.
Bye, y'all.